My name is Jamie Battle. I'm 27 years old, and I'm a sergeant in the United States Army. I've learned to handle pain in some of the harshest places on Earth, but nothing ever compared to the concrete floor beneath the 14 steps of my family's basement. The fire from 4 broken ribs was nothing next to the ice in my father's eyes, Senator Arthur Battle, as he looked down at me. She says she slipped, my sister Renee lied with perfect composure, just moments after she'd snarled, "You're just a pathetic little soldier," and shoved me. My father didn't ask if I was okay. He gave an order. "Confirm her statement, Sergeant." He used my rank as a reminder of my place, of my duty to obey. "There's a fundraiser tonight. Don't ruin this family's image." They thought the soldier in me would just blindly follow orders, but they forgot one thing. A soldier's highest loyalty is to the truth. If you have ever been treated like an inconvenience to be hidden by your own family, tell me where you're watching from and hit subscribe. This story is for you. The first thing I registered was the cold. It was a damp, deep cold that seeped through the fabric of my uniform, right into my bones. The air smelled of mildew and earth, the signature scent of the McLean, Virginia basement I'd tried to avoid my whole life. A sharp, grinding pain flared in my left side as I tried to draw a breath. It felt like a shard of glass was twisting in my ribs. Then, the memory hit me. Not like a wave, but like a fist. It had started over something so small, so insignificant. My Army sharpshooter qualification badge. I'd left my uniform jacket on a chair upstairs, and when I came down to the basement to find an old photo album, I found Renee holding it. She wasn't looking at it with pride, or even curiosity. She was holding it between her thumb and forefinger as if it were a dead insect. "Look at this," she'd said, her voice dripping with the casual condescension she had perfected over the years. "The little soldier's toy. Do you really think this cheap piece of metal makes you a hero, Jamie? I just wanted it back. It wasn't a toy. It was a symbol of months of discipline, of learning to control my breathing, my focus, my very heartbeat under pressure. It was mine." "Give it back, Renee," I said, my voice low. She dangled it in front of me. "In the real world, my world, here on Capitol Hill, this means nothing. I have the power here. I'm the one who matters." That's when I reached for it. My fingers brushed against hers, and she recoiled as if burned. "Don't you touch me!" she shrieked, her face contorting with a rage that was terrifyingly familiar. And then she shoved me. It wasn't a little push. It was a full-body, two-handed assault, fueled by years of resentment. It was a brutal declaration of her place in this family, and mine. My foot caught on the top step, and for a terrifying second, I was airborne. Then came the series of sickening thuds as my body tumbled down the wooden stairs, ending with a final, definitive crack as I hit the concrete floor. Now, lying there, I heard footsteps on the stairs, but they stopped at the top. I craned my neck, the pain screaming through me, and saw him. My father, Senator Arthur Battle. He stood there, silhouetted against the light from the hallway, his posture ramrod straight, his face an unreadable mask of political stone. He looked not like a father, but like a judge about to pass sentence. He didn't come down. He didn't ask what happened. He just looked from my crumpled form to Renee, who was already composing her lie. "She slipped, Dad. She's so clumsy sometimes." My father's gaze shifted back to me, cold and assessing. "No hospital," he declared. The words, so devoid of concern, unlocked a memory I had buried deep. I was 16. Renee, furious that I had accidentally broken the strings on her tennis racket, had thrown her championship trophy at me. It caught me just above the eye. Blood streamed down my face. My father hadn't taken me to the ER. He sat me down at the polished mahogany kitchen table, cleaned the wound with antiseptic that stung like fire, and sealed it with 2 clumsy butterfly bandages. As he worked, he'd lectured me. "You need to learn not to provoke your sister," he'd said, his voice tight with irritation. "Don't you dare tell anyone about this." Later that night, my mother, Elizabeth, brought a bowl of chicken noodle soup to my room. She sat on the edge of my bed, avoiding my gaze. "Your sister is under a lot of pressure with her college applications, honey," she'd whispered. "Just be the bigger person, Jamie. for the family. My sacrifice was always taken for granted. My pain was always an acceptable cost for their peace. A ragged gasp escaped my lips, a mix of pain and fury. I need a hospital. I managed to force out between clenched teeth. A military hospital. That's what made him move. He descended the stairs, not with the urgency of a worried parent, but with the slow, deliberate menace of a predator. He crouched down, his face just inches from mine. His voice was a low hiss, like steam from a cracked pipe. Do not challenge me, Jamie. You know what I can do. One phone call from my office to the Pentagon, and your service record gets a permanent note about psychological instability. You'll spend the rest of your career filing paperwork at some forgotten base in Alaska. Your career, Sergeant, will be over. The message was brutally clear. His image, Renee's future, they were paramount. My entire life, everything I had worked for was just a chess piece he was willing to sacrifice without a second thought. And Renee? She was standing just behind him, her arms crossed, a smug, victorious look on her face. But something in his threat backfired. Amidst the searing pain, a cold, sharp clarity washed over me. This wasn't about a broken trophy or a fall down the stairs anymore. This was a battle for my life, for my truth. With a grunt of effort, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My fingers, trembling with adrenaline, found the contact. The name glowed on the screen like a flare in the dark. Aunt Sarah. My mother, who had been hovering silently at the top of the stairs, finally broke. A small, desperate sound escaped her lips. Arthur, please, she begged, her voice thin and reedy. This is different. My father straightened up and blocked the bottom of the stairs, his body a solid wall. He looked at the phone in my hand, then at my face. His own face hardened into a final, non-negotiable offer. Fine, he clipped out. You can go. But you will tell them you fell. You will stick to that story. If you don't, my offer about Alaska still stands. That is the only way. I looked past him, at my sister's triumphant smirk. I looked at my mother's terrified, pleading eyes. And I looked at the man who was supposed to protect me, now holding my future hostage to protect his perfect, political lie. He thought the soldier in me would obey. But he was wrong. In that moment, I realized this was no longer a family dispute. It was a firefight, and I could not afford to remain silent. The ride to the hospital was wrapped in a thick, suffocating silence. The smooth leather seats of the Mercedes felt cold against my skin, a stark contrast to the throbbing heat in my side. I kept my eyes fixed out the window, watching the immaculate white picket fences and perfectly manicured lawns of McLean blur past. Each pristine house looked like a miniature fortress, hiding its own secrets. I could feel my mother's eyes on me in the rearview mirror. It wasn't the look of a worried mother checking on her injured child. It was the anxious, darting gaze of an accomplice. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice a fragile, pleading whisper. Jamie, you know Renee has this important internship coming up, on the Hill. A little trouble right now. It could affect everything for her. There it was. Not, Jamie, how much does it hurt? Not, Jamie, I am so sorry this happened. Just concern for Renee, for the perfect image. I didn't answer. I just kept watching the blur of white fences. In that moment, I realized my mother wasn't just making excuses for my father's cruelty or my sister's violence. She was defending the entire system. A system built on the unspoken rule that my peace, my safety, my very existence, was always the acceptable sacrifice. Her words were the key that unlocked the floodgates of my memory. And the pain in my ribs was suddenly drowned out by the aches of 100 older wounds. The first memory that surfaced was a Thanksgiving, the year I turned 18. I had spent the entire day in the kitchen, carefully following my grandmother's handwritten recipe for roast turkey with a cranberry and pecan stuffing. The whole house smelled of sage and roasting butter. I was proud. It was the one thing I felt I could contribute to these perfect family gatherings. As we all sat down at the dining table, before I could even bring the turkey out, Renee raised her wine glass. A toast, she announced, beaming. I just got my early acceptance letter from Georgetown. The room erupted. My father, Arthur, stood up, his chest puffed with pride. To my brilliant firstborn, he boomed, raising his own glass, continuing the Battle family legacy. The rest of the dinner became the Renee show. Her plans, her future, her inevitable success in Washington. I slipped back into the kitchen and brought out the turkey, golden brown and perfect on my grandmother's platter. I set it in the center of the table. Renee glanced at it and wrinkled her nose. "Oh, none for me," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "I have to watch my figure." No one else touched it either. They were too busy carving up Renee's future. Later that night, long after everyone had gone to bed, I found myself alone in the silent kitchen. I pulled the cold platter from the fridge, carved off a slice of turkey, and ate it standing over the sink. It tasted like loneliness, and it was in that cold, quiet kitchen that I decided I needed to find a different family. One that might actually be hungry for what I had to offer. The thought of finding my own way brought another, sharper memory to the surface. My high school graduation. I was valedictorian. I had spent weeks practicing my speech, a speech about finding your own path. I had hand-delivered the invitations to my family, my heart pounding with a foolish, stubborn hope. But when I stepped up to the podium and looked out at the crowd, the row of seats I had reserved for them was empty. Just 4 vacant chairs staring back at me. I found out later, through a casual remark my mother made, that they had flown to New York City for the weekend. There was an art auction at Christie's that Renee had desperately wanted to attend. An art auction. I spent that night sitting on my bedroom floor, the valedictorian plaque heavy in my lap, feeling nothing but a profound emptiness. My greatest achievement, the culmination of years of hard work, hadn't really happened. Because in my family, if they didn't see it, it didn't exist. My own attempt to create a life outside of their shadow was met with the same dismissive indifference. I remembered the day my acceptance letter to the U.S. Army arrived. I held the official envelope in my hands, a ticket to a world of discipline, honor, and purpose. Everything our house lacked. I ran downstairs, bursting with the news, but the living room was already a flurry of activity. Caterers were setting up, and balloons bobbed against the ceiling. It was a surprise party. For Renee, she had just landed a summer internship in a senator's office. When I finally managed to get my father's attention and showed him my letter, he glanced at it for less than a second. "That's nice, Jamie," he said, before turning to direct a waiter. "At least the Army will teach you some discipline." The words were a casual gut punch, dismissing my choice as a remedial course for a problem child, not a calling. The Mercedes slowed, turning onto the wide, orderly streets of Fort Belvoir. Seeing the uniformed guards at the gate triggered one last, painful memory. The day I graduated from basic training. It was one of the proudest days of my life. I stood taller, felt stronger than ever before. But as I scanned the crowd of cheering families, my own was nowhere to be found. Only Aunt Sarah was there, her proud smile a lone beacon in the crowd. My parents had called that morning with a vague excuse about a last-minute work emergency. 2 days later, I saw the pictures on Renee's Instagram. The whole family, smiling on a sailboat in Martha's Vineyard. The caption read, "A much-needed weekend getaway to help me de-stress before finals." The car finally rolled to a stop in front of the imposing entrance of Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. I took a deep, careful breath, the pain in my ribs a sharp reminder of the present. This was it. I was out of their world and on my own turf now. This was a place built on codes of conduct and articles of justice. A place where loyalty was earned, not demanded. A place where the truth, no matter how ugly, was supposed to matter. The battle for my family's approval was over. I had lost that war years ago. The real battle, the one for my own damn self, was just beginning. Inside the sterile white walls of the Walter Reed examination room, the world slowed down. The chaotic, emotional whirlwind of my family's home felt a million miles away. Here, there was only order, procedure, and the quiet hum of medical equipment. My focus narrowed. I was no longer just a daughter in pain. I was a soldier, a patient, a set of facts waiting to be documented. The doctor who came in was Captain Eva Rostova. She was a woman who seemed to be carved from granite, with sharp, intelligent eyes and an Eastern European accent that clipped her words with precision. She moved with an economy of motion that I recognized instantly, the mark of a fellow officer. She introduced herself, her handshake firm, and began her examination. Her touch was gentle but methodical, her questions direct. "So, Sergeant Battle," she began, reviewing the initial intake form on her tablet. "It says here you fell down a flight of stairs." "Yes, ma'am," I replied, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. She didn't respond. Instead, she gently probed the discolored, swollen area on my left side. I winced, sucking in a sharp breath. "Please lift your arm," she instructed. As I did, she examined the bruising from a different angle. She was quiet for a long moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. Then she looked directly at me, her gaze unwavering. "Sergeant," she said, her voice completely flat, devoid of judgment, "these are finger marks, bruising consistent with a grasp, not a fall." And just like that, the truth was in the room, spoken aloud by a stranger. For the first time in hours, someone saw what was real, not what was convenient. I didn't sob. I didn't break down. A single hot tear simply escaped and traced a silent path down my cheek. It was a tear of profound, aching relief. The X-rays told an even more brutal story. Captain Rostova pulled the images up on a large monitor, her face grim. "Well, you didn't imagine the pain," she said dryly. "You have 4 fractured ribs here, 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 and here." She pointed with a pen at the faint, spidery lines on the ghostly image of my skeleton. "And a hairline fracture in your left wrist, likely from breaking your fall." She zoomed in on another area, a section of my upper arm. "But this is what concerns me." She indicated several small, dense white patches on the bone. "This is calcification. It's the ghost of an old injury, a previous fracture that healed on its own, without being properly set. Your chart shows a history of accidents." Her voice wasn't accusatory, it wasn't even sympathetic. It was the voice of a scientist stating a fact. "Sergeant, what I'm seeing here is a long-term pattern of physical trauma." Before I could process that, a nurse announced that my family had arrived. A knot of dread tightened in my stomach. A moment later, they swept into the room, bringing the suffocating atmosphere of our home with them. My father immediately switched into what I called senator mode. He strode over to Captain Rostovi, his hand outstretched, a practiced, charming smile plastered on his face. "Captain Arthur Battle, a pleasure," he said, his voice resonating with false warmth. "I can't tell you how much I appreciate the excellent care you provide here. In fact, my office helped secure the funding for this new diagnostic wing. We have to take care of our service members." He was marking his territory, subtly implying that this institution owed him. "I trust we can handle this matter, discreetly," he continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "It was just a clumsy, unfortunate family accident. No need for a lot of paperwork." Captain Rostova didn't smile back. She didn't even blink. She looked him straight in the eye, her posture unyielding. "Senator," she replied, her voice as sharp and sterile as a scalpel, "my loyalty is to my patient and to the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The UCMJ requires me to report any and all suspected cases of non-accidental injury. It's not a choice. It's my duty." A flicker of annoyance crossed my father's face. He wasn't used to being defied. My mother, Elizabeth, quickly stepped in, her voice trembling slightly as she repeated the lie about me slipping. But it was Renee who delivered the next blow. Leaning against the wall with an air of bored arrogance, she added, "Honestly, if something happened, she probably brought it on herself. She's always been dramatic." I watched as Captain Rostova, without looking away from Renee, casually tapped the comment into her notes on the tablet. "Potential witness statement," she murmured, just loud enough for everyone to hear. The air crackled with tension. My father shot me a look that was pure venom, a silent threat to remember our deal. But it was already too late. The situation had escalated beyond his control. Just then, the door opened again. A woman in civilian clothes, a practical pantsuit, and sensible shoes stepped in. She carried an air of no-nonsense authority that immediately commanded the room. "Captain Rostova," she asked, her voice calm but firm. She held up an ID. "Special Agent Carter, Army CID. I was told you had a possible assault victim." My father took a step forward. "Now, wait a minute. I think there's been a misunderstanding." Agent Carter didn't even look at him. Her focus was entirely on me. "I'll need to speak with Sergeant Battle alone." "She is my daughter," my father protested, his voice rising. "I am her father, and I am a United States Senator. You will not question her without me present." For the first time, Agent Carter turned her attention to him. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply gestured with her head toward the hallway, where I now saw two uniformed military police officers standing at attention. "Sir, with all due respect, this is now an official criminal investigation. You and your family will wait in the designated waiting area." "Now!" I saw something I had never seen before in my entire life. My father was speechless. He was completely and utterly outmaneuvered. The power he wielded in Washington meant nothing here. He was just a civilian in a military jurisdiction. The MPs escorted him, my mother, and a stunned-looking Renee out of the room. The door clicked shut, leaving me alone with Captain Rostova and Agent Carter. The silence that followed was no longer suffocating. It was cleansing. For the first time, I felt like I could finally breathe. I wasn't in an examination room anymore. I was in a sanctuary. In the quiet sanctuary of that hospital room, with the ghosts of my family finally banished to the hallway, I told my story. For the first time, I told all of it. Sitting on the edge of the examination bed, the paper crinkling beneath me, I gave my official statement to Special Agent Carter. I reported it the way I was trained to, chronologically, factually, without emotion. I talked about the broken tennis trophy when I was 16, the empty chairs at my graduation, the Thanksgiving dinner where I became invisible, and finally, the shove, the fall, and my father's cold-blooded threat. Agent Carter just listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer pitying glances or comforting phrases. She simply took notes on a standard-issue notepad, her pen scratching methodically in the silence. She treated me not like a fragile victim, but like a credible witness, like a soldier. Her respect was a balm on a wound I didn't even know was still bleeding. When I finally finished, the room was heavy with the weight of years of unspoken truth. Agent Carter clicked her pen shut and looked me square in the eye. "Sergeant Battle," she said, her voice steady and sure, "thank you for your statement. Thank you for trusting us with this." She paused, and her professional demeanor softened just a fraction. "I was a soldier once too, an MP. You learn pretty quickly that our most important duty is to have our brothers or sisters back. We protect our own, no matter where the battle is." She stood up, her face firming with resolve again. "From now on, we protect you." I was discharged a few days later with my ribs tightly bound, my wrist in a brace, and a temporary protective order in my hand. The piece of paper felt both powerful and flimsy. It was a legal shield, but I knew it couldn't stop the psychological warfare that was about to begin. The voicemails from my mother started almost immediately. They were never angry, which would have been easier to handle. They were soaked in a cloying, manipulative sorrow. "Jamie, honey, it's Mom," the first one began, her voice thick with staged tears. "I just don't understand. You're tearing this family apart. Your father's career, Renee's entire future. How can you be so selfish?" Another one arrived the next day. "Your father is just trying to protect this family. Why do you have to be so difficult? All he's ever wanted is what's best for us." Each message was a carefully crafted guilt trip, designed to make me feel like the aggressor, the problem. The old Jamie would have buckled. The old Jamie would have started to believe it. But this time was different. I applied my training. I treated each voicemail not as a personal attack, but as an enemy communication to be logged and archived. I created a new folder on my phone. Evidence. I saved every message. I documented the time and date of every call that violated the protective order. My pain was being converted into data, My fear was being converted into a strategy. The war, however, was also being fought on a different front. Back at the barracks, the atmosphere had chilled. My father's influence was a subtle poison, seeping into my professional life. Whispers started to circulate, quiet, vague rumors about my mental instability. I'd walk into the mess hall and conversations would stop. Soldiers who used to joke with me now just gave me a tight, awkward nod and kept walking. The isolation was a heavy cloak, and I could feel myself starting to suffocate under its weight. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling day of physical therapy followed by condescending questions from my unit's CO, I felt close to my breaking point. I dragged myself to my locker, the metallic clang of the door echoing the hollowness I felt inside. But then I saw it. Tucked next to my boots was a chocolate chip Cliff Bar and an ice-cold bottle of blue Gatorade. Propped against it was a small piece of paper torn from a prescription pad. The handwriting was sharp and precise. It said, "Strength isn't just physical. You are not alone. Captor R. Captain Rostova." I stood there for a full minute, just staring at that simple act of kindness. It wasn't pity. It was support. It was a lifeline thrown to me in the dark, a quiet acknowledgement from one soldier to another. That simple gesture gave me more strength than 1,000 words of encouragement ever could have. It was fuel. It was a reminder that I had allies, even if they operated in the shadows. That night, sitting on my bunk in the sterile quiet of the barracks, I knew I couldn't fight this alone. I needed my own fortress. I pulled up the contacts on my phone, my thumb hovering over the names that had caused me so much pain. Father, Mother, Renee. I scrolled past them, my heart heavy with the weight of what was broken. Then I stopped. One name. One last hope. Aunt Sarah, my father's older sister. A retired Army First Sergeant, the only person in my family who had ever looked at me and seen me, not a disappointment or a problem. I took a deep, shaky breath, my mind racing with how I would even begin to explain the tangled, ugly mess my life had become. I prepared myself for disbelief, for questions, for the inevitable lecture about family loyalty. I pressed the call button. She picked up on the second ring. Sarah Battle. Her voice was exactly as I remembered it, strong, no nonsense, like gravel and coffee. "Aunt Sarah," I started, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. "It's Jamie. Something's happened." There was a pause on the other end of the line, but it wasn't a pause of shock. It felt like anticipation. Then her voice came back, clear and steady, cutting through all my fear and uncertainty. "I know, Jamie," she said, and there wasn't an ounce of surprise in her tone. "I've been waiting for this call for 10 years. If you've ever had one person who believed in you when no one else did, please hit the like button and in the comments, just type the word 1. I want to see how many of us have been saved by that one person." My aunt's words over the phone echoed in my head for the rest of the week, a steady drumbeat of hope against the rhythm of my fear. I've been waiting for this call for 10 years. What did she know? What had she seen? The questions fueled me, pushing me through the whispers at my unit and the agonizing physical therapy sessions. That Saturday, I drove my beat-up Honda down I-95 to Quantico. My aunt lived in a small, tidy bungalow just a few miles from the Marine Corps base, a world away from the political grandeur of my parents' McLean mansion. When she opened the door, she didn't hug me or fuss over the brace on my wrist. She just gave me a firm nod, her eyes taking in every detail with the practiced assessment of a first sergeant. "About time you got here, soldier," she said, her voice gruff but warm. "Coffee's on." Her house smelled of freshly brewed coffee and lemon-scented wood polish. It was a scent of stability, of order. We sat at her small kitchen table, the morning sun streaming through the window. I had brought a folder with my medical records from Walter Reed, the official documentation of my injuries. "All right," she said, after pouring me a mug of black coffee. "Tell me what he threatened you with." I hesitated, the shame of my father's power play still fresh. He said he'd have a note put in my record. Psychological instability. Said he'd get me reassigned to a desk in Alaska. Aunt Sarah let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a sound devoid of humor. "Let my brother try," she said, her voice turning to steel. "I've been keeping my own records on your accidents for years, Jamie. He has no idea what I have." Those words hit me like a physical shockwave, blowing away the fog of isolation that had surrounded me for as long as I could remember. She stood up, walked over to an old cedar chest in the corner of her living room, and pulled out a heavy gray metal lockbox. She placed it on the kitchen table with a solid thud. The sound of the key turning in the lock was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. Inside weren't old photos or family heirlooms. Inside were 3 spiral-bound notebooks, the kind you buy at any drugstore, their covers worn with age. She opened the first one. Her handwriting was neat, precise, and disciplined. A soldier's script. She slid it across the table to me. My eyes scanned the first entry. August 12, 2010, I read aloud, my voice barely a whisper. Jamie with a sprained ankle. Arthur's story. Tripped over one of Renee's lacrosse sticks on the stairs. Fact check. Renee was at summer camp in Maine. Did not return until August 22nd. My breath caught in my throat. I flipped the page. May 22nd, 2014. Jamie with a black eye. Arthur's story. Walked into a door. But I overheard Renee on the phone with a friend, laughing about how she'd finally taught her little sister a lesson. Entry after entry, year after year, it was a meticulous, heartbreaking chronicle of my life. A sprained wrist from being pushed during a basketball game. A concussion from slipping on wet leaves. Each incident was recorded with the date, the official family excuse, and my aunt's own quiet, damning observations. It was a dossier of pain, a secret history of my survival. "I started after that Christmas when you were 15, she said, her voice softer now. "You had this faint, yellowing bruise on your wrist, right where a hand would grab you. When I asked about it, your father just brushed it off, said you were clumsy. But I saw the way you glanced at Renee. Just for a second, it was fear. A soldier knows that look, so I started writing things down, just in case. A soldier knows the value of good intel. She wasn't just my aunt, she was my intelligence officer, my silent guardian. All those years I thought I was alone. She had been watching, documenting, and waiting. She was the living embodiment of the Army values I had sworn to uphold. Loyalty, duty, honor, integrity. She had been my one-woman rear guard, and I never even knew it. That afternoon, we turned her kitchen table into a command center. We spread out my official medical report from Walter Reed, the photos of my bruises, and her notebooks. We cross-referenced dates. The history of physical trauma Captain Rostova had found on my x-rays lined up perfectly with the accidents my aunt had recorded. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was a timeline, a pattern, incontrovertible proof. I took pictures of every single page of her notebooks and emailed them to Agent Carter with a brief, formal message. The reply came less than an hour later. It was a phone call. "Sergeant Battle," Agent Carter's voice was electric with a new energy. "What you just sent me, this is what we call corroborating evidence. It's a game changer. It establishes a documented pattern of abuse and concealment. This changes everything." She informed me that with this new evidence, they were moving forward with formal assault charges against Renee. And the investigation into my parents' role as accessories was now a top priority. For the first time in this whole ordeal, I didn't feel like I was defending myself. I felt like I was on the attack. The shift came just in time, because my father's counteroffensive was escalating. The following week, my commanding officer, Colonel Davis, called me into his office. Davis was a man a few months from a comfortable retirement, and the last thing he wanted was a scandal involving a U.S. senator in his unit. He cleared his throat, avoiding my eyes. "Sergeant," he began, shuffling papers on his desk. "I've received a call from Senator Battle's office. They expressed some deep concern for your mental well-being." He looked up at me, his expression uneasy. "They suggested that perhaps a less stressful role might be better for you right now. A transfer to an administrative position, perhaps." The old Jamie would have shrunk. The old Jamie would have accepted, just to make the pressure stop. But I wasn't the old Jamie anymore. I had a lockbox full of truth on my side. I stood up, came to parade rest, and looked him directly in the eye. "Sir," I said, my voice as steady and hard as I could make it. "With all due respect, I am not unstable. I am injured. The CID is building a case based on the evidence of that injury." I let that sink in. And I am ready, willing, and able to perform my duties. Colonel Davis leaned back in his chair, a flicker of surprise, and maybe a little fear, in his eyes. He had expected a victim. He got a soldier. The battle for my career wasn't over, but I had just won a critical skirmish. In the weeks that followed, the on-base chapel became my refuge. It was a simple brick building with plain wooden pews and stained glass windows that cast muted colors across the floor. It was the one place I could go where the silence was peaceful, not threatening. I wasn't particularly religious, but I found a sense of order there, a quiet space to process the storm that was brewing. One afternoon, as I was sitting in a back pew, trying to focus on my breathing, the heavy oak doors creaked open. I glanced back and my heart froze. It was my mother. She stood there, framed in the doorway, looking frail and lost. Her hair was unkempt and there were dark circles under her eyes. Every part of me screamed that it was a calculated performance, a perfectly staged emotional ambush. She walked slowly down the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space, and slid into the pew next to me. She didn't look at me at first, just stared at the altar. "Jamie, my darling," she began, her voice cracking as she wrung her hands in her lap. The tears were already welling in her eyes. "Please, I'm begging you. You have to stop this. Your father, he could lose everything. The investigation, the party is talking about asking him to step down." She finally turned to me, her eyes pleading. "And Renee, her internship is gone. Her whole life, her future. It's being destroyed." She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. Not once did she ask how my ribs were healing. Not once did she ask about the nightmares. Her entire plea was a ledger of their potential losses. "Our family is falling apart, Jamie," she whispered, a tear finally spilling over and tracing a path down her cheek. "And it's all because of you. God wouldn't forgive a daughter who destroys her own family." For a moment, the old Jamie, the one conditioned for guilt, felt a familiar pang. But then a quote from a book Captain Rostova had recommended, something by Brené Brown, flashed in my mind. Daring to set boundaries is about having the courage to love ourselves, even when we risk disappointing others. A cold, hard clarity settled over me. I looked at my mother, not with anger, but with a sudden, devastating pity. "Family?" I asked. My voice was quiet, but it cut through her performance like a razor. "A family doesn't shove one of its own down a flight of stairs, Mom. A family doesn't threaten to ruin their child's career to cover up a crime." I shook my head, the last bit of childish hope inside me dying. "The thing you're trying to save isn't a family. It's a lie. A carefully constructed public lie." My words hung in the sacred silence between us. Her face crumpled, not in understanding, but in frustration. And then, as if on cue, the doors opened again. It was Renee. She strode down the aisle, her heels clicking angrily on the stone floor. There was no remorse on her face, only pure, undiluted arrogance. This was a coordinated attack. "See?" Renee snapped, not at me, but at our mother. Her eyes, however, were locked on mine, burning with hatred. "I told you it was pointless. She's always been like this, always trying to ruin things for me because she's jealous." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a venomous sneer. "You're pathetic. You run off to play soldier because you can't handle the real world. You're just a selfish little grunt, and that's all you'll ever be." That was it. That was the last straw. The insult, the lie, the sheer audacity of it, all happening in the one place I had sought peace. It was too much. Something inside me, a dam that had held back a lifetime of pain and swallowed injustices, didn't just crack. It shattered. I stood up slowly. I wasn't the scared teenager anymore. I wasn't the invisible daughter. I was Sergeant Jamie Battle, and my breaking point had been reached and surpassed. Enough, I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it resonated with an authority that stunned them both into silence. I turned to my mother first. You are asking me to protect my own attacker. You are manipulating me in a house of God. You don't get to do that anymore. Then I turned to Renee. I looked her straight in the eye, and for the first time, I didn't see a golden child or a powerful rival. I saw a hollow, insecure bully. I am not jealous of you, Renee, I said, and my voice was laced with a calm finality. I pity you. Her jaw dropped. She was so used to my fear, she had no defense against my pity. I took a step back, creating a physical boundary that mirrored the emotional one I was about to build. I looked from my mother's tear-streaked face to my sister's shocked expression. I am done, I stated, each word a brick in a new wall. I am done being the family shock absorber. I am done being the acceptable sacrifice for the family image. My gaze settled on my mother. From this moment on, I am not your quiet, broken daughter. I am a soldier who was assaulted. I took a breath, feeling a surge of power I had never known. It was the power of my own, unvarnished truth. And my fight as a soldier has just begun. If you have ever had a moment where you finally said, enough is enough, please hit that like button. And in the comments, I want you to write the 2 most powerful words in the world. I'm done. Let's see a wall of them. Let's declare it together. Walking out of that chapel, I left the ghost of the old Jamie Battle behind in the pews. The woman who walked into the sunlight was different. My pain hadn't vanished, but it had been forged into something else, a weapon. My vow of silence was broken, and my declaration of war was made. Now it was time to plan the campaign. The next morning, I walked straight into the Judge Advocate General's office on base, the JAG Corps. Aunt Sarah met me there. They assigned me a legal counsel, a sharp-focused captain named David Chen. His office was standard military issue, gray desk, government issue computer, American flag in the corner. But we quickly converted it into a tactical operations center. We spread everything out on his conference table. My medical files from Walter Reed, the preliminary report from CID, the audio files of my mother's manipulative voicemails, and the crown jewels. Aunt Sarah's meticulously kept notebooks. Captain Chen reviewed the materials, his expression growing more serious with each page. This is extensive, Sergeant. This isn't a family lawsuit, Captain, I said, my voice steady. Aunt Sarah gave me a firm, approving nod. This is a military campaign. The opposing force has political influence, financial resources, and media connections. We can't just react. We need a strategy. From that point on, my training kicked in. I stopped thinking like a daughter and started thinking like an analyst. My first objective was intelligence gathering. Sun Tzu's The Art of War, a book I'd studied at officer candidate school, became my new Bible. Know your enemy and know yourself, and you will not be imperiled in 100 battles. I knew my father's tactics, intimidation, manipulation, and the leveraging of his power. But I needed to understand his vulnerabilities. I spent hours online, creating a detailed network analysis chart. I mapped out every political connection, every major campaign donor, every friendly journalist in his orbit. A clear pattern emerged. His entire empire was built on a carefully curated public image of a patriotic family man. That image was his center of gravity, and his dependency on high-profile donors was his biggest weakness. While I focused on the political landscape, Aunt Sarah activated her own network, the old guard of retired, non-commissioned officers who seemed to know everything about everyone. She made a few discreet calls to some old friends at the Pentagon. Within a day, she had intel on my CO, Colonel Davis. He was, as suspected, angling for a cushy executive position at a major defense contracting firm post-retirement, and, unsurprisingly, that firm's CEO was one of my father's top 5 campaign contributors. It wasn't just a phone call from a concerned father, it was a command from a future employer. The next step was to secure my own flank. I couldn't fight this war if I was constantly worried about being undermined within my own chain of command. I requested a formal meeting with the Inspector General's office, the IG. I presented my case professionally and dispassionately. I laid out the timeline of my father's attempts to interfere, from the threat in the basement to the pressure on Colonel Davis. I provided the names, dates, and a copy of the defense contractor's donation records. I wasn't a hysterical daughter. I was a sergeant reporting undue command influence, a serious offense under the UCMJ. The IG officer, a stern-faced major, listened without interruption and assured me they would launch a full inquiry into Colonel Davis's conduct. My father, of course, was waging his own covert war. One evening, Aunt Sarah called me. "You're being watched," she said, her voice low. A silver sedan had been parked down the street from my barracks for 2 days. She'd run the plates through a friend who was a private investigator. They belonged to a PI firm in D.C., known for digging up dirt for political campaigns. Instead of feeling fear, I felt a cold surge of anger. "He's looking for a weakness," I said, "something to discredit me." "Then we won't give him one," Aunt Sarah replied, a tactical gleam in her voice. "We engage in a little counterintelligence." So that's what we did. I became the model soldier. I was the first to arrive for PT in the morning and the last to leave the motor pool in the evening. My weekends were spent volunteering for on-base community projects or studying for my promotion board. I made sure the PI got plenty of photos of me living a life of impeccable military discipline. Let them report back to the senator that his daughter was, in fact, everything a soldier should be. Knowing my next performance evaluation was a key battlefield, I launched a preemptive strike. I volunteered for every difficult task, every undesirable duty roster. I worked twice as hard, ensuring my performance was not just satisfactory, but exemplary. I documented every single achievement, every compliment from a superior. I also quietly requested letters of recommendation from other officers in my command, respected leaders who judged me on my merit, not on my father's whispers. I was building my own dossier, a dossier of competence and honor. A few weeks into our campaign, I got a call from Captain Chen. "Good news and bad news, Sergeant," he said. "The IG investigation is putting Colonel Davis on the hot seat. He's backing off. That's the good news." "And the bad?" I asked, bracing myself. "I just received a call from your father's attorney, a high-powered civilian lawyer from a firm on K Street. They are formally requesting a mediation meeting with you, your family, and your legal counsel present." I stood a little straighter. I could see the whole board now. I knew my enemy, I knew his tactics, and for the first time, I knew my own strength. "It's not a peace offering," I said to Captain Chen, my voice calm and clear. "It's an ambush." He paused. "I agree. So, what's our move?" A slow smile spread across my face. "We accept," I said. "Let them set their trap. This time, I'll be ready." The law office was on K Street, the heart of Washington, D.C.'s power corridor. It was exactly the kind of place my father would choose. Expensive art on the walls, polished mahogany furniture, and a panoramic view of the city that screamed influence. The air was thick with the scent of money and ambition. They were already there when Captain Chen and I arrived. My father, my mother, and Renee sat on one side of a massive conference table, their own high-priced lawyer beside them. They looked like a royal family holding court, radiating an aura of untouchable confidence. My father was in his element, a senator ready to negotiate a treaty. Renee had a smug look of victory on her face, and my mother just looked pale and anxious, a silent accomplice to the execution. My father's lawyer, a man with silver hair and a silk tie, opened the proceedings with some legal jargon. But it was just the opening act. My father quickly took over, launching into a well-rehearsed speech about the sanctity of family, the pain of misunderstandings, and the importance of healing. It was a performance worthy of the Senate floor. Then came the offer. "Jamie," he said, his voice dripping with condescending paternalism, "we all want to put this unfortunate incident behind us. We want what's best for you." He slid a document across the polished table. "This is a proposal for a trust fund, a substantial one, 7 figures. It would be set up in your name, immediately." His lawyer chimed in. "In exchange, all Sergeant Battle would need to do is withdraw her official complaint with the CID and sign a standard non-disclosure agreement. Think of it as a fresh start, Jamie. my father added, his smile never reaching his cold eyes. A chance for you to build a new life for yourself. A comfortable life. You won't have to keep playing soldier anymore. That last phrase was designed to be a dagger. It was meant to diminish me, to reduce my entire identity, my service, my sacrifice, into a childish game. He thought he was offering me a golden parachute. What he was really offering was a bribe to buy my silence, to erase my truth. Captain Chen began to speak, to lay out the legal reasons why this was inappropriate, but I placed a hand on his arm to stop him. This was my battle to fight. No, I said. My voice was quiet, but it landed in the silent room with the force of a gavel. My father's smile tightened. He had expected this. This was part of his script. I see, he said, leaning back in his chair. You want to do this the hard way. He let out a theatrical sigh. Then don't blame me for the consequences, Jamie. Your annual performance review is coming up. I had hoped not to have to interfere, but one call from my office about your emotional instability will ensure you never get promoted. You'll retire as a sergeant if you're not discharged first. Your ambitions, your future, all of it, gone. He smiled then, a thin, cruel curve of his lips. It was the smile of a man who had just played his trump card. He believed he had me trapped. He believed my career was the only thing I had, and he was threatening to burn it to the ground. But he was fighting the last war. He didn't know I had a new arsenal. Slowly, deliberately, I reached into my own briefcase and pulled out a simple, manila folder. I placed it on the table between us. The sound it made was soft, but it felt like a thunderclap. You're right, Dad, I said, my voice calm and even. My performance review is coming up. I opened the folder and slid the first document across the table toward him. These are letters of support from every single officer in my direct chain of command, commending my exemplary performance over the last 3 months, particularly under what they call extreme personal duress. His smile faltered. He glanced at the letters, his eyes scanning the signatures. I slid out a second document. And this is the preliminary report from the Inspector General's office. I pushed it toward him, making sure the heading was clearly visible. They're investigating your call to Colonel Davis. They find your attempt to exert undue command influence a matter of particular concern. They seem to think a senator trying to manipulate a soldier's career is a pretty serious offense. The color drained from his face. His confident posture began to collapse. He was no longer a senator. He was just a man watching his power evaporate. Renee stared at the documents, her face a mask of disbelief, her mouth slightly agape. My mother had started to quietly weep into a handkerchief. Then I pulled out the third and final document. It was a single, crisp sheet of paper. And this, I said, my voice ringing with a clarity I had never felt before, is my acceptance letter to the Army's Officer Candidate School program. It arrived last week. I pushed it right in front of him. It turns out that in the United States Army, integrity and personal courage are still considered valuable assets for a leader. Checkmate. The silence in the room was absolute. My father stared at the papers, his face a horrifying canvas of shock, then confusion, then pure, unadulterated panic. Every weapon he had, every threat he had just been neutralized. Every lever of power he thought he controlled had been stripped from his grasp. He had lost control of the narrative. He had lost control of me. I stood up. I felt tall. I felt free. I looked at the 3 people who had spent a lifetime trying to make me feel small. I don't need your money, I said, my voice clear and strong. I never needed your approval. I looked at Renee, who was now pale as a ghost, and then at my mother, whose sobs were growing louder. This meeting, I declared, is over. With Captain Chen right behind me, I turned and walked toward the door. I didn't look back. I didn't feel hatred or anger or even sadness. All I felt was the clean, quiet, beautiful release of a battle hard fought and definitively won. The day of the court hearing, I chose my uniform carefully. Not my daily combat uniform, but my formal Army service uniform, the dress blues. I wore it not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a soldier reporting for duty. My duty that day was to the truth. As I sat in the military courtroom, the fabric crisp and structured, I felt a sense of calm resolve. I wasn't alone. Aunt Sarah sat in the row directly behind me, her posture as straight as my own. Beside her was Captain Rostova, who had come not as my doctor, but as a quiet pillar of support. This was my chosen family, my honor guard. When my name was called, I walked to the witness stand and swore my oath. I recounted the events, from the shove down the stairs to my father's threats. I spoke clearly, concisely, sticking to the facts just as Agent Carter had instructed. My testimony was clinical. The medical reports from Walter Reed provided the cold, hard science, but it was Aunt Sarah's notebooks, entered into evidence, that painted the undeniable picture of a decade-long pattern. Faced with the mountain of evidence, Renee crumbled. Her lawyer advised her to take a plea deal. She stood before the judge, a military officer with graying hair and a chest full of ribbons, and admitted to the assault. Her confession was a mumbled, tearful mess. The judge's sentence was swift. Renee was found guilty of assault, given 2 years of probation, and ordered into mandatory anger management counseling. Then the judge looked directly at me and issued a comprehensive 5-year protective order, legally barring my father, mother, and sister from contacting me or coming within 500 feet of my person, my home, or my place of work. Before dismissing the court, the judge, a retired colonel himself, took a moment to address the room. He spoke not just of the crime, but of the context. He condemned the arrogant abuse of power and the toxic perversion of family loyalty displayed by my parents. Then he looked at me. "Sergeant Battle," he said, his voice resonating with authority, "it takes a rare form of courage to uphold the Army values of honor and integrity when the battlefield is your own home. You have done your duty. Be proud." Afterward, in the hallway outside the courtroom, the professional world began to deliver its own verdict. Agent Carter pulled me aside. "It's starting," she said quietly. "The Senate Ethics Committee has officially launched an inquiry into your father's conduct, citing the IG report and the outcome of this trial." She showed me a news alert on her phone. 2 of his biggest corporate donors had just publicly withdrawn their support. The empire my father had built on image and lies was beginning to crumble under the simple, immense weight of the truth. I expected to feel a surge of triumph, of vindication. Instead, I just felt quiet, a strange, hollow emptiness. The war was over. The enemy was vanquished. But all that was left was the wreckage. There was no victory parade, only ashes. Through the chaotic scrum of lawyers and court officers, I saw my mother. She was standing alone near the elevators, untethered from my father for the first time I could remember. Without his imposing presence beside her, she looked incredibly small and lost. As a news camera flashed nearby, she reflexively raised a hand to shield her face. The sleeve of her blouse slid back, and I saw it. A faded, yellowish-green bruise on the inside of her wrist. A bruise in the exact shape of a gripping hand. A bruise I had seen on my own body a dozen times before. In that gut-wrenching instant, my perspective shifted. The anger I held for her, the righteous fury at her complicity, it just dissolved. It was replaced by a tragic, aching pity. She wasn't just an accomplice in my father's regime. She was another one of its victims, trapped in a gilded cage of fear and luxury. A few weeks later, a letter arrived at my barracks. The envelope was expensive cream-colored stationery, and the handwriting was my mother's elegant, looping script. I took it outside and sat on the steps, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. The letter wasn't an apology. It was a lament. A long, rambling account of everything they had lost. The prestige, the friends, the invitations to DC galas. It was a litany of their suffering. It ended with one final manipulative plea. "I pray that one day you can find it in your heart to forgive us." I read the letter twice. I thought about the lessons I'd been studying from an old book on Stoicism, a philosophy about accepting what you cannot change and focusing only on what you can control. I couldn't change my past. I couldn't change who my parents were. But I could control my future. I could control what forgiveness meant for me. The forgiveness my mother was asking for was permission to return to the way things were. It was an invitation back into the lie. But the forgiveness I needed was different. It was permission for me to let go, to put down the heavy burden of their betrayal and walk away, free and clear. I decided then and there that I would forgive them, not because they deserved it, not because they had asked for it, but because I deserved to be at peace. Slowly, methodically, I tore the letter into small, neat pieces. I let the wind catch them and scatter them across the manicured lawn of the base. I watched them go, like releasing doves or burying the dead. It was a quiet, personal ceremony, a funeral for a family that never really was, and the final, necessary act of closing a door that needed to stay shut forever. 6 months later, life as Second Lieutenant Jamie Battle had found a new, quiet equilibrium. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky that felt wider and clearer than ever before. I lived in a small, sun-drenched apartment off base, a place that was entirely my own. There were no ghosts in the hallways, no landmines under the floorboards. It was just home. For the first time in my life, I understood what that word was supposed to mean. My weekends found a new rhythm, too. Most Saturdays, I'd drive down to Aunt Sarah's house. We'd spend hours in her garden, our hands covered in rich soil, talking about everything and nothing. Afterwards, we'd sit in her warm kitchen, the scent of a freshly baked apple pie filling the air. And just be. These simple, peaceful moments were the kinds of memories I had always craved, the ones I was now building for myself, brick by brick. The Army had kept its promise. I graduated from Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning, at the top of my class in tactics and leadership. The faded scar on my wrist was a permanent reminder of the battles I had fought, but the pain associated with it was gone. It was no longer a mark of shame, but a part of my story, a symbol of survival. And that story, I learned, had a purpose beyond my own healing. My experience gave me a unique voice, and I was asked to become an advocate for the Army's family violence prevention programs. I started speaking at leadership training seminars, sharing a carefully edited version of my story. I didn't go into the gory details. I didn't need to. I focused on the lessons: how to recognize the subtle signs of abuse, how to break the chain of command's tendency to handle things internally, and how to create a culture where asking for help is a sign of strength, not weakness. A few months ago, a young private in my new platoon, a quiet kid from Ohio, came to me after a briefing. He was hesitant, his eyes darting around nervously. He told me about his wife, about her constant jealousy, the way she controlled his access to his own money, how she isolated him from his friends. It was psychological warfare, and he was losing. I didn't give him advice. I didn't tell him what to do. I just listened. And then I walked him over to the Family Advocacy Program office and waited with him until a counselor was available. I gave him the one thing I had never been given: a witness. A confirmation that his pain was real and that he was not alone. That, I realized, was my legacy. Not the story of what was done to me, but what I chose to do with it. My new family, the one I had forged in the fire, grew stronger. Captain Rostova, now Major Rostova, became a trusted mentor. We'd have dinner once a month at a diner halfway between her post and mine, talking shop and life over burgers and coffee. Special Agent Carter still kept in touch, sending me postcards from her assignments all over the world. A picture of the Brandenburg Gate from Germany, a view of the DMZ from Korea. Each one had a simple message on the back: "Stay strong, Lieutenant." And then there was Ethan, Sergeant Ethan Hayes. He had been a quiet presence in my old unit, one of the few who never bought into the rumors. He'd just shown up, day after day, and done his job, treating me with a steady, unwavering respect that was more comforting than any words. Now, he had become an essential part of my new life. We spent our free weekends hiking the trails of Shenandoah National Park, the Blue Ridge Mountains stretching out before us like a promise. We could spend hours in the comfortable silence that only two soldiers can truly understand, a shared language spoken without a single word. One afternoon last week, a text message appeared on my phone from an unknown number. My heart seized for a second, a phantom limb of old fear. But the message wasn't a threat. It was an update. "This is a message for Jamie Battle," it read. "I am Elizabeth's therapist. She asked me to let you know that she has left Arthur and is currently in a long-term residential treatment program. That is all. No request. No plea for contact. Just information." This past weekend, standing on a hill overlooking Quantico with Aunt Sarah, the spring breeze cool on my face, I thought about that message. I don't know if I'll ever be ready to see my mother again. I don't know if that door will ever reopen. But I realized, as I looked out at the horizon, that it didn't matter. Wherever she was, whatever she was doing, I hoped she found peace. My own peace was here. It was in the solid ground beneath my feet, in the uniform I wore with pride, and in the limitless sky ahead. The most difficult mission of my life, the mission to heal myself, was ongoing, but the battle was over. For the first time, I was free to command my own life, and my future was an open horizon waiting for orders. Before I go, I want to say thank you for listening to my story. That horizon I was looking at in the end, it wasn't just mine. It belongs to every single one of us who has had to fight for our own peace. My story is proof that our past does not get to write our future. We do. If this story resonated with you and you believe in the power of survival and rewriting our own narratives, please subscribe to this channel. We are a community of survivors. For your final mission, comment below with one step you are taking this week to command your own life. Thank you. Lieutenant Battle, signing off.